You've installed raylib through the Windows installer from itch.io, and you've taken a look at Notepad++ for raylib. And while it's a quick and easy way to get started with programming in raylib, it's a little bit restrictive, and the scale of project that you hope to build is not really supported by this type of editor. If that's true, then I want to show you game-premake. Game-premake is available on the GitHub page for raylib-extras, which is kind of a community account that's used by a few core members of the raylib community to post some extra features that didn't really fit into raylib, either because they have too many external dependencies or because they're just not related to this core function of raylib, which is that Spartan programming for adventurers. The repo I want to focus on today is game-premake. So this is a Git template. I don't use it as a Git template, but I do download it and modify it and use it as my template for all of my raylib projects. Game-premake is powered by Premake, which is a simple build configuration tool. You can set up a script in a few different spots of your project directory, and once it's all configured, you can copy and paste that folder and generate all kinds of new projects, usually with one click. The generated projects are compatible with a wide range of editors. It includes a makefile, but it will also generate a min.gw configuration or a Visual Studio configuration. There is also a .VSCode folder included so that you can use it with VS Code. Today we're going to look at VS Code and Visual Studio, but like I said, this is compatible with many other editors. Just like any other Git template, I like to do code, download zip, and I'll go into my C raylib folder and make a project directory, and I'm going to paste the zip in here. Now, if we unzip this directory here, we can see this is the Premake template. Now, this template includes some things that I don't generally use, and so the first thing I like to do is clean it up a little bit. This extras and this static lib folder can go. There is some default resources in here. I will have none of that. If we go into the game folder, we can see include and source. I don't like to have a separate include folder. I just keep all my source in the source folder. I'll edit this Premake 5 Lua script. At the bottom, we can see link to static lib. I've removed that, so I will remove it from the Lua as well. And this main.cpp is a lot more elaborate than what I tend to use. In fact, I usually use a C source file, so I'm going to go ahead and update this really quick. Okay, I think that's fine. I guess we'll find out later when I try to compile it. Okay, I think this is in a good state, so I'll be able to use this as a template now. Let's take a quick look at how we can get those editors. So for Visual Studio Code, if you search VS Code installer, we can see visualstudiocode.com, and you can just download the installer right from here. I'll link directly to this page in the description. In the case of Visual Studio 2022, you want the community edition, unless you have a license to the professional edition. You can just search for that, and first link, we have a download right here. In the past, the community edition had considerable differences from the professional edition, but today their functionality is virtually the same. Like I said, if you don't have a professional license, it's not really like you have a choice. First, we're going to look at VS Code. So I'll copy this template and I'll just call it my project. It's very important that if you intend to use VS Code with this, that your project name has no spaces. I'll launch VS Code and I can just drag my project directly in. Do I trust the authors? Yes, I trust the authors of all files in the parent folder projects. This is what I recommend you do so you don't have to see this message every single time you open a new project, but your mileage may vary. Maybe you don't trust the authors. If it's your first time opening a C or C++ project in Visual Studio Code, then you might get this message. Do you want to install the recommended C, C++ extension pack? I recommend that you install this. Now that we've opened the project, right away we're being confronted with the thing that every programmer wants to see, which is red squiggles on the include statement. This is never a good sign. Usually this means something is really not set up right. But in my case, I'm just going to hit F5. We can see raylib not found downloading from GitHub. It's worth mentioning that with game-premake, if you don't have a folder called exactly raylib-master inside of the directory and it contains the source code of a version of raylib, it's going to go to GitHub and get the absolute latest. Now, working off of the absolute latest of raylib, that's your choice if you want to do that. But with most projects, you're not going to want to have the version of the framework or engine that you're using be like variable and have potentially having it change all the time. So now that I've built the project, it seems like I can control click on raylib.h and jump to it just fine. So I'm thinking that that red line was probably not super relevant. But for you, if you run the project and those red lines still don't go away, then just jump into the Explorer view, open VS Code, and look through these different JSON files here and just make sure that all the configuration is right. You know, there might be something here that where it's looking at a compiler path or something that's not exactly correct based on your setup. This template works on the assumption that you're going to have GCC, G++, min.gw, make, GDB, and any other required binaries for running a program and debugging it to be accessible from the environment variable path. You might be required to go to Edit System Environment Variables, click Environment Variables here, and then choose Path and hit Edit, and make sure that raylib w64 dev kit bin is in there. Adding source files in VS Code is the same whether it's a pre-existing source file or an entirely new one. All you have to do is place the source files into this src folder. They will be compiled and linked. You can also use Control-N to create a new file, and then I could do Control-Shift-S to do Save As and make sure it goes into source. Also make sure that it's, .c. You can also right-click on source and hit New File, and you can just place one directly in the right spot. So I can just type in my other .c and hit Enter, and that will work as well. And like I said, if it's a new file, I can also just drag it right in here. So I'll take my grid C and grid H from 2048, and I can drag it right into source. You don't have to do it from this view either. So I can right click and say Reveal in File Explorer, and I could add them from here as well. And you can see it'll be updated right away in VS Code. With this project configuration, you can freely use C or C++. Just make sure that if you intend to use C, everything is .c, and if you intend to use C++, then it's .cpp. The header files can be .h or HPP or HXX or whatever, it doesn't matter. Something else that a number of C projects will intend to do is to actually mix C and C++. So sometimes you have a C++ library that you want to use, and you want to use a particular feature of it, and it's very dependent on C++. If you know what you're doing, it's fairly easy to write wrappers around certain C++ headers. For now, I'll just contrive a really simple example here. So as I said, it's really important that your interface is compatible with C. So even though in my CPP file, I'm going to use some C++ only stuff, the header needs to use pure C. So here is my C interface. And now I'm going to come in here and I can include this second H, and I'll implement my function. The point being, this is C++ only code. Now, the thing is, if I try to run this, so if we build this, everything's fine, and it's easy to see that there was no compiler errors or no issues. But of course, the thing is, we're compiling this C++ unit and we're compiling this C unit, but we're not actually trying to link between them. So that's where the real trouble comes in. So I'll include second H, and I'll attempt to call getNum. And it doesn't really matter what I do. I'll just put it in X and not use it. But the point is, I'm going to try to call getNum, and this is where we're going to run into our issue. So you can see down here, LDEXE, undefined reference to getNum. So that's kind of annoying because we've defined getNum right here. And we clearly have, obviously this is like the prototype, and then this is the definition. So you can think of it as declaration and definition. We have our definition here. We should not be getting this linker error. The problem is that in the linking step, the linker doesn't understand that this function is allowed in C, because in this translation unit, we haven't provided any information that actually says that it is allowed in C. And so the way that we need to do this is the extern keyword. So we can put extern and then in double quotes, capital C, and our include for second H inside of second CPP should go inside of this extern. Now, if it's just the one function, then there might be a different way that this can be written, but this is the general foolproof way. So you have your header, all of your function declarations will be in here. You can extern C, and if I go back over to main.c, we're including second H. So in this case, it's going to include the C header, and that's fine. In this one, it's going to include the header, but with the context for the compiler, when we actually compile this translation unit, we're going to see that we're saying that these functions should be accessible to C as well. So during the linking step, when we're looking for the definition for getNum, it'll know that it's allowed to look in this translation unit for the definition because we've specified at the top that this definition is allowed to be called from C. Build it again, and this time we don't get any linker errors and the game will run. Now, of course, we're not doing anything with this value. This is like a very contrived example, but the point is that if you plan on having C++ called from C, that is the missing key. You need to have this extern or it's not going to work. Two more notes on the VS Code here. The first thing is, if you ever run into weird issues where you're having all kinds of linker errors and you know that you've been messing around with these files, for example, I can make a folder here and call it other, and I can move my second CPP and H into other, And if I try to, well, first of all, let me update this include statement. If I try to build now, you can see no rule to make target source second.cpp needed by second.o. This was a weird one. Basically what I found is if I look in second.d, that I could see this definition is assuming that second CPP and second H live directly in source, but they now live in source other. So worst case here, you need to do what's called a clean. I couldn't find the simplest way to do the clean using make with the pre-make configuration, but in my case, it's a matter of debug. I'm just going to remove these .d files. And when I build, those won't be found. It'll have to compile them and link them again. So if there's ever weird stuff, just remember that you always have the option to actually clean your debug folders. You can go through and delete anything that's binary or object and run it again, and that should do it. The last thing I want to show you in VS Code here is the source control option, which I think this is an extremely important tool for every developer. I think even if you don't plan on publishing this project at any point to something like GitHub, or you don't plan on open sourcing it at all, I think having a local repository as you work on the project is extremely valuable. It allows you to roll back any mistakes that you make. You can go back and look at the performance of things before you change certain stuff. It's also great for tracking progress. If you want to make some kind of devlog or something and talk about the state of your project, you can always jump back a few weeks, take a quick screenshot, jump forward, take a screenshot, jump forward. You know, it gives you a lot of freedom on working on the project. And then of course, if you do plan on publishing it later, creating a local repo early on in development and using that, you can always import an existing repo with all of its history to something like GitHub. So if you're in the project folder here, then you can go into the source control. Usually there's an icon here, but you can also choose view source control, and that'll open up this panel. It might be on the left side for you. But under source control, you can see folder doesn't currently have a Git repository. You can initialize a repository. We want to do that. So if you click initialize repository, if you don't have Git installed, the options will probably look different, and you will need to install Git. The installer is quite long. There's a lot of configuration that you can do. Probably all of the defaults are fine. For fun, I'll show you what values I used, but pretty much however you set it up, it's going to be fine. There's not any urgent, like make sure you do this or it'll break. As long as you install Git, it should be fine. You might need a system restart if installing Git and then coming back doesn't work immediately for you. But once that's done, you can click on that initialize, and then you'll have this menu here, source control. So we can see here, we can put a message. You want to put something like project init or init commit, added project, something like that. These are common. On this changes tab here, you can see all of the changes that you've made locally, which in the case of all the text assets, it's just going to be going from an empty file to having a bunch of text in it. So that's not super valuable to review, especially since we're just kind of dumping the project into the repo. You're going to want to click this plus stage all changes here, which is going to mark all of these changes as being things we actually want to include in Git. And then type a message here and hit commit. If you don't type a message before you hit commit, it opens up this kind of confusing tab on the left, and all you have to do here is add some message, save, and close the tab. Now we're going to look at the same workflow, but for Visual Studio. So with VS Code, all we had to do was open the folder in VS Code. For this one, we need to first generate the project that Visual Studio is going to use. Thankfully, that's just a matter of running this single pre-make Visual Studio bat. When that's done, we'll see that we have a .sln file, which has the same name as the folder. So this will be the name of your project. Double click on the SLN and it should open in Visual Studio. If you have more than one version of Visual Studio installed and it tries to open it in an older version, then this likely won't work. If that's a problem for you, you can right click on the SLN, open with, and then choose the correct version. As always, your Visual Studio will probably be laid out different than mine, so I'll try to be very general when I'm talking about the different tabs. If you click on View, the first option is Solution Explorer, which is going to be very important. This is how we navigate to different files. You can see we have two projects inside of our solution. So we have raylib and then my project. The raylib project is going to be based on the local copy of raylib that we have, which was automatically installed when we ran the pre-make. We can access any of the source files and header files from raylib. So this is great. Naturally, raylib being open source, one of the benefits to having that is that you have a local copy of the source code. And so when you're debugging issues or if you want to make changes to the framework, it's very easy. You can just make the changes directly on these files. And the next time that you build the game, those changes will be applied. In the context of this, though, I'm only concerned with the my project. So if I go into the source files of that, then I can see there is my main.c. When we decide we want to build and run the project, you can use the F5 hotkey, or we can click on this local Windows debugger up at the top. It'll build raylib if it's not built, and then it'll build the game, link up the raylib source and everything. And there we have it. When we want to add new source files, we can right click on source files, add new item. We can also go to project, add new item. When you do this for the first time, you'll probably get this simplified interface here where it just has the last folder in the path and then the name. I prefer to click on show all templates because then we can see the C++ file and the header file. And we can also see the full path, which is almost right. It's not just game, but we want game source. So we'll change that. And then for the name, I'm working with C right now, so I'll click C++, but then what I want to do is select this whole name and I'll just go other.c. And there we go, that creates our new source file. If we want to create a header file, like I said, click header file. The location should now be right. The first time that you run Visual Studio, it will be wrong, and probably every time you run after it, it will be wrong. So the first time you add a new file after restarting Visual Studio, you'll need to double check this location. We can fix it later. If it ends up being wrong, that's fine. I'll show you how to do that. But just get in the habit of checking the location. And like I said, with the source files, it'll always default to CPP, but you could just do Control A and type in the whole name, including the correct extension. You can also get in the habit of, once this opens, doing Alt-N to just select name, and it'll automatically select all, and you can just type in the name that you want. If you do Alt-N, it'll put your focus on the name field, and then you can do Shift-Tab to jump back up to the type. So I can do Alt-N to go to the name, Shift-Tab, press down, and then Tab, and now I can type in the header name that I want. If you have pre-existing source files that you want to add, you can also go project, add existing item, and then we can navigate to them this way. But I don't want to lose sight of the underlying project. Yes, we're editing it through Visual Studio, but this is not a Visual Studio project. It's a pre-make project. So we actually don't need to use Visual Studio for most of these operations. If I want to add an external source file, I can also go into game, source, and I know this is where I want my files to end up. I can just paste my proper source files in here. So this is my CPP and header file from the previous example. I can just paste them right in here, and then I go back up to the project root and I can run pre-make Visual Studio again. This is going to regenerate the solution file and properly use those new files that I've added. The next time I focus Visual Studio, I'll get this notification here. So we have, I think, some local changes or something. I might be upset, but the thing is I want to discard unsaved changes and load the updated project from disk. That's the option that I want. Sometimes the pop-up will look differently, and the option you'll want to choose is reload all, but just read the options carefully. If you make the wrong choice, you can always just close Visual Studio, run the bat, and then open it again if that whole thing frustrates you. Just like with my prior example, we have the same extern C here. Let's just make sure that that still works. Indeed, it still compiles and runs. That's good. Also wanted to mention that Visual Studio is okay with different hierarchies as well in your source. So you could choose to have your second be in its own folder, have your other be in its own folder like this. And as before, run the pre-make again, reload all. And of course, anywhere that you are referring to those headers from outside of that folder, you'll have to update those references. And you can see that unlike with VSCode, where it got confused and upset when we moved the C++ file into a different folder, in this case, it handles that very nicely. Partly because we're regenerating the project solution, so it knows to move the symbols around. Also similar to Visual Studio Code, there's nothing wrong with mixing C and C++, and you can just change the types and the right compiler will be used. So everything about that is the same as before. And just like with the Visual Studio Code, I also want to show how we can look at source control. So we can look in view and we have git changes, git repository. There's also just a whole separate git tab. If we go to the git changes tab, then we can see here git version control isn't being used yet. So we have the same option as before. We can create a git repository. Here we want to choose local only. Local path looks good. That's where my project is. And you can even do a license template, but I say worry about that later. This is a local repo that we're talking, so there's no reason for a license because we're not distributing it at all. Of course, if you know you want to put it on GitHub or Azure or some other existing remote, then you can choose those options accordingly. But that's more of a if you know what you're doing option. So I'll hit create. And we can see here, it's a fairly similar interface to VS Code, but unlike VS Code, it does the initial commit for us. So if I go view all commits, we can see that there is one separate one to add Git attributes, and then there's add project files. And this is where all of the project stuff got added all in one swoop. Important to note that the standard git ignore included with premake does not actually cache any of the Visual Studio generated files. This is because, like I said, this is not a Visual Studio project. The whole point of this project is that it's a premake project. So anything that supports premake, you'll be able to edit the project with. But that also means that if you're editing the project with a particular editor, we prefer not to have all of the generated stuff that the editor creates to pollute the project. All right, I think that covers everything I need to say about premake and the game-premake template. Let me know in the comments if you intend to use this premake, and of course, if you have any issues with it, then you can always ask in the comments. You can take them to the GitHub issues page. You can ask in the Raylib Discord. A lot of people use this template, so I think it should be no problem finding help. Hope this helped. Happy coding.